will now move with our last speaker, which is the founder and CEO of E-Scopics. You can applaud Claude Cohen-Bacri, which is here. Hi, Claude.
So E-Scopics is the second startup I'm founding. I founded it in the end of 2018. And prior to this, I founded Supersonic Imaging, which was an ultrasound imaging company mainly dedicated to radiology. And as we'll see, E-Scopics now addresses another type of doctors because we do ultrasound imaging for everyone but the radiologist. So that's what I will share with you. And as a matter of fact, I thought, okay, this is more a testimony than, I'm not here to give any recipe, but maybe to share some thoughts about the impact of AI in the industry of ultrasound imaging, which is mainly, originally, an industry dealing with radiology. So it's a testimony on the thoughts we had in 2005 when we started Supersonic Imaging, and how these thoughts have changed and have evolved in 2018 with the creation of E-Scopics. Okay, so in fact this presentation will go over these two examples, two companies, Supersonic Imaging and E-Scopics. Supersonic Imaging is a company manufacturing big ultrasound machines for radiology. And E-Scopics is more a point-of-care ultrasound company. As we'll see, it addresses everyone but the radiologist. And we'll see finally how and which business model would best fit AI for JAG. So Supersonic Imaging first. So that's a company that we created in 2005. I'm no longer with the company. The company has now been sold to Hologic. But it's a company that was putting on the market for the first time an ultrasound machine which has an increased characterization of the tissue, which is called elastography, which measures the stiffness of tissue. Ultrasound is, it's important to understand that imaging is not a diagnosis. It's a very important difference when you are in the field of radiology. When you sell imaging systems to customers, you are not selling diagnostic systems in the sense that you are not providing a diagnosis. You're providing an image, and it's up to the radiologist to give the diagnosis, and that makes a big difference with regulatory entities, with the 510K instead of a PMA for the FDA, for instance, because you do not claim that you do a diagnosis. If you want to introduce AI onto a radiology device, you change the class of your device, and this raises big issues. The first idea we had, obviously, and this is an old idea, we took it again in 2006 or 7, was to try and help the doctor, the radiologist, classify the breast lesions that he's looking at when he examines a patient. So this shape can be completely different. And as a matter of fact, there has been an algorithm developed by radiologists, and when I mean algorithm, it's an explicit algorithm, it's not AI, developed by radiologists to help them classify the probability of malignancy of a lesion. But it is not done as such. What is done is we are looking at features on the breast lesion, and we are characterizing these features, and according to them, we give what we call a BI-RAD score. A score which, in fact, a posteriori is related to a probability of malignancy. So it is not a direct diagnosis, and when you sell an ultrasound machine to a radiologist, you give him the ability to make the image, and he does all this algorithm in his head, and he puts that in the report. The idea was to try and develop and automate this classification. And this has been done by several companies. MediPattern was one of these companies. We are talking back in 2008. This company no longer exists, by the way. Trying to extract features, descriptors on the image to try and automate the delivery, I should say, of these diagnoses. There was a huge reluctance from the ultrasound companies at that time to integrate that onto their machine, mainly because it would change the class of the machine, it would completely change the business model, and it was not probably the right time, and the company died. Another approach that we had at Supersonic was to say, okay, I am not going to do what the radiologist does, which is outlining the lesion, but I am going to go and add information, and this information was the stiffness of tissue to try and help him diagnose the lesion. So it is not CAD, it is just a way to map tissue stiffness on top of the lesion to try and see if this information, because it is related to the pathology of the lesion, could help him classify its lesion. We put that on the market. Needless to say that it was a long process to have this cleared because the FDA was suspecting, so I'm passing this. So the FDA was precisely arguing that if you put an information that is related to a number, you can actually do a diagnosis, and you would eventually change the class of your device. So it had to be it was a 3-year process for us to obtain 510K clearance of this mode. We did it step by step. We first gave the mode as a color mode without any numbers, just to say this is a distribution of stiffness. Then we claim that we had to change the dynamic range of the image to try and put the max and the mean number. And then we said that we wanted to have a way to register in time the value, and therefore were able to quantify elastography. So just for you to understand that when you are a company wanting to add more information for the diagnosis, and sometimes you don't even want to give the diagnosis, but you want to add a quantitative information to help the diagnosis, this is already very difficult because the FDA is seeing in that trend a way to do a diagnosis, and they don't want you to do that because the class of your device does not allow this. Again, this was back in 2010, so things have changed since. Huh? So this is, for instance, an example that we then did. We did a clinical study. We actually organized a clinical study, demonstrated that when we add this information onto conventional ways of classifying lesion, you can actually correct the way you classify these lesions, and you can remove unnecessary biopsy, and you can save and actually biopsy lesions that you would not have biopsied otherwise. So it was a real add-on to the current classification, and we decided to have that published. And after that, many other hospitals or doctors tried to build on that, and here we had some publication done by doctors to promote the use of this technology in combination with some artificial intelligence, but this was not us, Supersonic, doing that. So the strategy here was, we are not going to put on the market a device that does a diagnosis. We are really we are going to stay within our framework of an imaging device being sold, and we are going to let the doctors and hospitals do their publication, and this is what is going to be helped then by scientific communities or radiology societies to promote the use of this artificial intelligence on working with our device. But we stayed clearly outside the field of AI within this company. This is still the case, even though today, because there are more and more papers and more data that are being published, and because AI is a trend, so today the company is asking itself again how to better promote AI, but nothing to be said on that today. In fact, I don't know now that I've left the exact strategy on that. Another example was the stiffness in the liver, which was actually here used to measure the fibrosis in the liver. As you can see here, 2 levels of fibrosis in 2 different livers to try and monitor the evolution of this disease. Some publication, same strategy for liver than for the breast. Some publication was done by the doctors, and this was then, when you have sufficient publications, scientific societies or hepatology societies create guidelines based on this publication. And these guidelines are, in fact, algorithms that doctors are following to use your device and to give the diagnosis. But here again, a conscious decision not to include, so this is yet another set of publications, not to include any AI in the device. So same strategy for breast and liver within supersonic imaging. Computer-aided diagnosis tools are being kept outside. Eventually, AI is used to automate image acquisition, image settings, but nothing is said about it. You do not promote that. However, times are changing. Today, we talk a lot about AI, and CAD tools, computer-aided diagnosis tools, are being approved, as we've seen. Of course, the way I see this is, and what we see today, is companies building big database or using big database from hospitals to develop their algorithms and then putting the algorithm on the market. It's very difficult to do that when you are a single company, simply because you are not going to have sufficient images. You do not own the way you register your images. It's the hospitals that does this. So you have almost no control to do that and no sufficient database. And second of all, when you want to build a good algorithm, you have to have a sufficient diversity of images. So if you use only your images, it's not going to be robust enough. So I would say that building an AI-based algorithms solely dedicated to your data might be difficult when you are in the radiology, when you are a radiology company. Okay? This might change if you change the form factor of your device. If your device becomes so ubiquitous that the number of images that you can generate literally explodes, then you can try and own a clinical investigation, I would say, which will help you define your algorithms. And that is what we are doing with E-Scopics today. With E-Scopics, we are trying to democratize the use of ultrasound towards whole healthcare professional. The thing is to say, radiology today is the only place where you use ultrasound to do your diagnosis, but what could you do before and what could you do after? So when you look at the clinical need we're trying to resolve, this is exactly the problem of the bottleneck that you go through when you are sick. You wait before going from your primary care physician to your specialist, then to go to the radiologist, then to go to surgery. And we are trying to solve that bottleneck. It's a bottleneck that is an issue for acute disease, but even more an issue for metabolic disease, where you loop constantly on this bottleneck. And what we are going to do is simply think about what interventional radiology has done, which is moving therapy upstream when the patient is still in the radiology suite. We are going to move imaging, and of course here the imaging we want to move upstream is ultrasound, because it's the only non-invasive, cheap modality to be moved to the specialist, to the primary care, and one day maybe to the patient. So we want to grow the role of ultrasound and to address more specialties. Some specialties already today use ultrasound. The urologists are doing the exam, the therapy, the follow-up with ultrasound. But we want to grow this market and eventually reach the primary care physicians. And the goal, in fact, is to move ultrasound outside radiology towards doctors that are not experts in imaging, that are not experts in image interpretation, which is why we now can eventually put some AI tools to help them interpret the image. This is obviously better done with very small devices, ubiquitous devices. And this trend to move ultrasound outside radiology towards specialty has already been demonstrated with some applications. Emergency medicine and anesthesiology have literally adopted ultrasound thanks to the form factor of portable ultrasound. So what we do is we are going to create an ultrasound ultra-portable device to address specialties. This is a market which globally is a 1.7 billion market worldwide, and it's everything but radiology, OBGYN, and cardiology. So we are not going to play in that space. We are going to grow the smallest part of the pie, which is actually the one that is growing the fastest at 8% CAGR in order to grow this market. So what to be done to grow this market? And this is where you will see that it's not even a choice to use AI or not. You have to add intelligence onto your system to make it ubiquitous and used easily. The first thing you want to do is get rid of a costly and bulky equipment. You want to have something totally, in fact, dematerialized. You want to have an app that you can download on your cell phone, on your smartphone. You want to have a transducer, a probe. You use your probe, it's working with an app, and it can be used anywhere simply because you have processing power everywhere around you. You have it on your smartphone, you have it on the cloud, and this is what we want to leverage, and this is what we want to do. We do nothing fancy. In fact, it's nothing new. It is what the music industry has done. Music industry, like every other digital industries, evolved towards this path. It goes from being digitized to being completely democratized. It's the 6D evolution, as it was illustrated by the Singularity University in Palo Alto. In fact, once it becomes digital, you can miniaturize it. But the real revolution becomes when you dematerialize it. You deconstruct a sound system today. You have an app on your cell phone. It's Spotify, for instance. And it reaches data that is in the cloud for music to display it on, for instance, some Sonos speakerphone. It's a completely moved from hardware to software. And this is what we want to do with ultrasound. What has already been done with ultrasound is from hardware devices, miniaturize them. It's done. This exists. And these populate what we call conventional point of care. These are miniaturized ultrasound machines with nothing new, no ultrasound elastography modes that can help you diagnose. It's really basic. It's used sometimes only for guidance and to guide a needle, for instance, or to see if you have a fluid in your body in emergency. What we are going to do, because we created Supersonic before, we know how to make an ultrasound machine with a software-based architecture. We know how to do that, and then what we're going to do with E-Scopics is we are going to move the software that was running on the GPU boards here. We are going to move the software out in the cloud, in a smartphone, which today, by the way, a Qualcomm chip has the same computing power than the very first ultrasound machine we had before. So there is computing power that we can leverage, and I think computing power, when we talk about AI, has become so cheap around us to be used that we want to leverage that. So we create a probe which has the electronic that is required to transmit and receive data. It's the only electronic that you need left. The software is put in the cloud, and you can display the image or the data everywhere. Of course, because we move the raw data, the native data of the probe, it's not an image that we move out of the probe to the cloud or to any device, we can then, and we will then use these data, which are not images, to run AI algorithms to, for instance, analyze the texture of a tissue to estimate its biological content. The second thing is image acquisition. It's still very difficult to position a transducer. Some groups, you mentioned, I believe, Desky is using AI to position, and there are going to be a lot of small companies doing that. We are doing that too. But this is not what we are pushing here. What we are pushing here is the way you control all the settings of focusing, number of line, frequency when you do an ultrasound image. There's a lot of tweaks that you have to know to manipulate an ultrasound system in order to have a good image. What we use here is the same analogy with yet another digital technology, photography. We do not want to tweak a lot of parameters to make a good image. We want to simply acquire and do software processing to make sure that the image is perfect. We replace hardware with software the same way the photo industry has evolved, and the same way you can now have beautiful pictures with your smartphone. So we want to get rid of this and only have a probe. The probe sends, receives, and the processing is what does the rest. And this is where, of course, there's a lot of intelligence behind. So in fact, instead of speaking about introducing AI into this machine, I would simply say that we simply move from hardware to software. We have access to a lot more computing power, and we can run a lot more algorithms to make an image, and this is what we do. And of course, there is neural network behind this, there is AI behind this, but it is not advertised as such, and we are still making an image. So we are safe with respect to the FDA. Now, this is where AI interpretation is going to be more visible, and it's going to be more visible in two ways. Of course, if we want to rely on the image to put the diagnosis, we will put on this machine or on this software, because the machine is a software now, a tool that helps us, for instance, characterize lesions and things like that. But this is not the first market we are going to address. What we want to shoot for first is add, the same way we did for supersonic, add quantitative imaging modes. Modes that can represent tissue parameters, physical parameters, the speed of sound, the attenuation, the viscosity, the tissue Doppler, the speckle characterization, that in fact are related to medical information. It's a big question whether when you do that, you display this information or you stay safe and display physical information. We will always stay on that front, right? Putting on the machine modes that indeed are related to this, but without necessarily do a PMA to demonstrate that what we measure is inflammation or what we measure is fibrosis. We will be very careful not to go through that step, which is quite tricky for the FDA. But I'm pretty sure that in several years from now, when we have sufficient data, we can move back to this decision and eventually have an approval for measuring, for instance, fibrosis, which is what we do in this first application that E-Scopics is targeting, which is the diagnosis of NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So what we are going to do is the first app, if you wish, is an app that the pharmas that are developing the drugs for NASH or the endocrinologist or the gastroenterologist are going to use to detect the patient that have fatty liver. We will basically provide an alternative to biopsy because we are going to map over the whole liver instead of just doing a small sample of the liver to diagnose NASH, a measurement of elasticity for measuring of fibrosis. And it's going to be a measurement as a continuous value instead of discrete values that are the values usually used in the pharma industry, which is called a METAVIR score. It's a score that monitors the evolution of fibrosis. And the problem of this score is that if you reduce by 10% your fibrosis, but you do not change score, the result of your drug is 0. So the pharma is pushing very strong to remove the need of biopsy for trials. They want to use a measurement that is continuous so that if they have the tiniest improvement of fibrosis level measured on a continuous value, they can have reached, they can reach their endpoint. So this is the concept that we have today, and it's a company that has 1 year old, but is able today already to do images of fibrosis level on livers and imaging. When you look at the device that we will want to have, it's just a drawing, nothing to do with what the product is going to look like. It compares to the existing ultraportable by the fact that it has quantitative imaging and it has all this automation to ease the way you acquire your image and provide the diagnosis. So this is the next step I was talking about. We are going to provide an imaging tool that is able to quantify these physical parameters. Now, because it's ubiquitous, because we hope and we think when the business model we are building is based on that it's to be ultimately every general practitioner will have a probe one day to extend their clinical exam. It's going to be like they have a stethoscope today, tomorrow they will have a probe. It's going to be so easy to do imaging that they will have a probe. And there's actually a strong push by the GPs in France to adopt ultrasound, and same thing in other countries. And once we have sufficient data, which is why we have to anticipate that and prepare the creation of big database, we will have sufficient data to create this model, to create this AI model which relates a set of physical parameters with a list of key features that are indeed giving a diagnosis to the doctor. But we are not there yet. So if I summarize, and if I want to look how to monetize artificial intelligence for a diagnosis in big words, and it can be imaging or the end diagnosis, what's in it for E-Scopics? I see three things. There's a sensor-related aspect, to use AI for the image acquisition, to position the image or to automate the settings. This is something that facilitates the use. There is a front-end processing related AI aspect in what we do, because the image reconstruction we are doing is using neural network. I've not talked a lot about that because it's not the topic today, but the back-end processing related AI is more what we usually think about when we think about AI, which is the computer-aided diagnosis tool. So I would say that within E-Scopics, we are completely within AI, and we speak neural network every day at work. However, the strategy to really value AI as a business is going to be twofold. One is a capital equipment related aspect, which is you sell your device, you sell your probe, so you sell a good that contains AI. And the other one will probably be you use your device and you click on within the app on help for diagnosis, and then it will probably be more as a SaaS model was mentioned, a pay-per-use type of business model. So this is something that we are thinking about today for this first application of liver. How should we, and I'm sharing with you thoughts, we have not decided anything today, but it's just for you to understand how we think and why we can orient our business towards three different business models. We can either sell the device and the software that goes with it. You've understood that the product is a device and the software that runs on your smartphone. You can sell it, and you sell the software, or you sell the license. You can basically try and, because it's a software, use the technique of the Spotify's or other software. You rent it or you subscribe to it for a given amount of time, and every month you pay. And there's actually a company, Philips, that is trying to adopt in the US this business model of renting or subscribing every month to a fee. I think it's about $400 a month to have the software that can run on your tablet to operate your phone. Or you can, because at the end of the day what we do is an imaging biomarker of the liver, you can use the same business model as a biomarker business model. You basically pay every time you use it. When you do a blood test, you pay every time you do the blood test. So we have thoughts about all this. Of course, it's to be thought about in the framework of what already exists. I'm not going into the details here, because if you do a pay-per-use model, how much should you pay for it? It's not reimbursed yet, but you have some other imaging exams that are reimbursed. So how do you estimate the cost that an exam would have? So we estimated €10, for instance, for this exam. And then you have to, because you own the company, because you are in the driver's seat of the company, you have to quantify the money that you will need in order to develop this market and to develop your business. And what you see is that compared to a pay-per-use model, if I move to an equipment purchase model, of course I will sell it more than €10, it's easier to faster reach a higher revenue and a higher basically return on investment within 5 years, I removed the numbers here for the sake of confidentiality, but basically it's the same scale. And what you see is that, of course, if you sell the equipment, you are going to reach faster, higher revenues.
Just a question.
Yeah.
When you sell the equipment, the GP will not use it only for NASH investigation. It will be a tool.
So today, so two things.
Just to compare.
Yeah. Today, the simulation that was done was not targeting GPs. It was targeting the gastro and endocrinology doctors. So it's a limited population. It's not a huge population. Yeah. And because, of course, we have a curved array transducer, it only images the abdomen. We still don't have the capability of imaging the arteries, or so we have a limited, yeah. So this is at 5 years, but when you look at 10 years, you see that because you build on recurrent revenue, the pay-per-use, you completely explode, and actually it's called exponential growth, these digital businesses, for that, because you build recurrent revenue, and it explodes, whereas revenues associated with purchase of equipment with a 7-year lifetime, usually, you kind of plateau very quickly. So sometimes something to think about also when you build this business model. Yes?
In your pay-per-user model, or you buy the equipment?
Yeah, so what we did is we bought we buy the probe. It's below 5,000 euro. It's nothing compared to, yeah. So as a conclusion, what I would say, and this last part was more on the strategy part. How do you, what do you sell to your investors in terms of return to investment? So as a conclusion, I would say that it is an healthcare trend to move towards what we call value-based care. So value-based care is really what do you get out of what you buy, and we now can think about valuing the diagnosis instead of valuing just imaging, for instance. What is JAG? What do we mean by JAG? It does provide a diagnosis, but I think the strength of AI-based diagnostic tool is that they can incorporate more than just a diagnosis. They can incorporate a prognosis of what you do diagnose. And I think this is probably the biggest strength I see in AI for diagnoses. And I showed you two businesses, how to adapt AI to your business. So we've seen the example of an existing business. It's very difficult to disrupt an existing business and add AI to it. It's much easier to start from scratch, which is why I started from scratch another company, to add this component to it. And I think I would say that newer companies like E-Scopics will certainly have to anticipate the last building block I talked about, the AI for diagnosis, by structuring a database in order to leverage that. And today there's another company called Butterfly Network that is actually asking all its customers to subscribe or to accept, to share the data that are going to be produced with their equipment in order precisely to anticipate that move towards AI. 3 major strategies for me to integrate AI into an existing portfolio. One is you have to develop a completely new paradigm of value. You really have to focus on the value you deliver. You have to own the disease continuum. You have to think about owning the whole disease continuum for your patients and facilitate the web of connectivity. So I will end by this slide, which is the question I'm asking myself. Before you ask me question, I am asking myself these questions every day almost. What are the challenges to differentiate my product, my medtech portfolio, and how can AI help with that? Which data could help me understand better my patient, my disease, my customers, my market? What benefit of my technology are not currently being tracked? And for instance, there's an analysis that is done by some companies on ultrasound where they are looking at how people are touching the buttons of an ultrasound machine in order to optimize the control panel. So this is an example. How can I apply AI to add value, obviously, and how can I move to a more patient-centric strategy. I think this is the whole trend of value care medicine today, to move towards the benefit for patients. So thank you very much.